podcasting Q&A for November 27th, 2017. Welcome. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from the audacitytopodcast.com. Got a lot of great questions lined up to answer for you. Some questions like about running multiple feeds from a podcast network, changing the podcast category, choosing the right microphone when you're on a tight budget, when specific needs, some things about your Apple ID, and more questions for you. Now, if you want your podcasting question answered during one of these Q&As, then email feedback at theaudacitytopodcast.com. Please keep your question concise. That makes it a lot easier to be able to incorporate into these Q&As. And you can join me for a live podcasting Q&A on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. And if you're watching in the live chat room right now, feel free to comment with your question, and I'll get to that when I can during this live stream. So first question came in from Micheal Delaney. He asked, I noticed on Noodle.mx network you have 12 shows. Is that 12 different feeds or is it one feed for all 12 shows? I'm wondering because I renamed my show 3 times in 10 months. Should I have 3 different feeds or one feed and 3 different names? So there are a couple things here. First, to answer the question about what I do with my own podcast network over at Noodle.mx, or eventually switching over to Noodlemix.net, because a lot of people pronounce it Noodle.mx, or they write the MX in all caps. That aside, though, what I do with Noodle.mx network is both things. So I have, at Noodle.mx, we have about 12 shows over there. Each show does have its own podcast feed. So it's submitted, each one is then submitted to all of the podcast apps and directories out there so that people can subscribe to each show individually, whether that's the Audacity to Podcast, Beyond the To-Do List, The Productive Woman, Once Podcast, Welcome to Level 7, Are You Just Watching, any of those shows. They can subscribe to only that one show. Plus, so they're able to do that because each one of those shows have their own RSS feed. Plus, each one of those shows also have their own websites. So there's theaudacitytopodcast.com, areyoujustwatching.com, welcome to level7.com, beyondthetodolist.com, and so on. And each website then is branded to that specific show with specific ranking and SEO for those shows and all of that stuff. So when you go to that website, you know that you're on the podcast website for that specific podcast. It doesn't look like this network site necessarily. The main purpose of Noodle.mx as a website is to have a presence for the overall network, and it links to the separate websites for the separate podcasts. It's very important to me that each podcast maintain its own branding, especially because my network, the biggest mistake I made with my network is making it such a hodgepodge, a mix-up of different things. We've got productivity, comedy, TV show, podcasting, Christian critical thinking, and more. So then it makes a lot of sense to have separate websites for each show. Now, some of those shows are becoming platforms for multiple shows, like the Audacity to Podcast is the audio podcast, and there's the YouTube channel where I also post these Q&As. And there's this spin-off podcast that I've been doing for the month of November 2017 for National Podcast Post Month. That's the name of it, where I've been doing Inside the Podcasting Business, a daily show. That is not going to be daily after November, but I may actually continue doing that podcast after November, and it may continue to live on the Audacity to Podcast as individual episodes, or it may get its own spin-off website. For our Once Upon a Time podcast, they did a spin-off TV show called Once Upon a Time in Wonderland. We kept that on the same website, but again, a different RSS feed. So yes, every show has its own RSS feed. Every show has its own website. Now, how we manage that is through Noodle.mx Network's own WordPress multi-site. That's a big, complicated, hairy issue that can work if you're doing multiple podcast websites where they all need the same plugins, same tools, basically. We do also offer a network all-inclusive feed that you can subscribe to Noodle.mx Network, and then you download every episode from every podcast through that feed. It's available in Apple Podcasts and some other podcast apps. That does surprisingly get subscribers. Actual downloads coming through that specific feed, I'm not completely sure, because I don't differentiate the feed download stats. But Do you need to do that kind of thing where you have a conglomerate feed? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on your network and the type of content you produce. And do you need separate domains for each podcast? It depends, again, on your network and the kind of content you produce. Like if your network is all around the same theme, then I think it makes a lot of sense for all of the podcasts to live on that one website instead of separate websites, like Horse Radio Network, for example, from Glenn Hebert. That's all the same theme, so it makes sense for them to be on the same network. Twit, same thing there, This Week in Tech. Everything is related to that theme, so it makes sense to all be on the same network page and website with separate sections on that website. Now, so that's for separate shows. And what's curious to me is you said you renamed your show 3 times in 10 months. Should I have 3 different feeds? Well, I kind of need more details, but you said if you renamed it 3 times, if it's the same show, but you've simply renamed it, as maybe you realize a better name would be better to use, you don't have to have 3 separate feeds. You don't have to have 3 separate websites or anything like that, because if it's the same show, you've simply tweaked the name a little bit, that's fine. Like, for example, let's say with our Welcome to Level 7 podcast, which is a Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. podcast. What if we started it with the name Welcome to Level 7, then later on renamed it to the Marvel's TV Show Fan Podcast, then later renamed it to the Marvel Cinematic Universe Fan Podcast, or something like that? Well, it's still the same show. We're simply changing the name as we realize the approach is expanding. So that's when it makes sense to have really only one feed, because it's one show. The show has simply changed names over the years. If your show has simply been rebranded like that, where maybe new cover art, new name, but it's still the same content, same show, then I think it makes sense to stay one feed. If instead you've launched one show and decided, this isn't really the topic I want to talk about, so then you launch a different show with a different name, and then you decide, no, I don't really like that one either. And then you launch a third one. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I do recommend that you find something that you can stick with, but I can understand when you play with something a little bit and then you realize it's not a good fit for you. This isn't a marriage. You don't have to stay committed in this covenant relationship, but you can start shows and then start something different. So in that case, if each show is a different show with a different title, then I think it does make sense then for each show to have its own RSS feed, even if the show only lasted for a few episodes. Now, if it only lasted for a few episodes, it's up to you whether you want that show to remain online. If it has timeless value, I think you can leave it online. And there's no reason that, let me say that differently. It's okay if you make a show that's a limited run show, maybe it's only 10 episodes or 5 episodes, something like that, and you feel like that addresses the topic enough, you can leave that podcast online without publishing new episodes. So I hope that answered your question, Mykahl, and thank you for that question. Cameron Wanless asked, asked, how can I get my podcast on Spotify? There are a couple ways to do this. One is if you are using the Libsyn RSS feed. So you're not only hosting your media with Libsyn, but you are also using their RSS feed for your show. Then you can contact Libsyn and ask them to submit your podcast to Spotify for them. Now, if instead you're using someone else to generate your RSS feed, or you are using your own website, for example, to generate your RSS feed, then there is a Spotify submission form that, surprisingly, they're using Google Docs for this. So what I'm going to do is below this video, so either if you're watching on Facebook, on YouTube, or somewhere else that this video might be embedded on a property I own, I'll include a link to the Google Docs forms. And this, regardless of how you generate your RSS feed, this is where you can go to submit your podcast to be considered for Spotify. They say you can submit multiple podcasts through the same form, but I might recommend submitting one podcast per form submission and just resubmit for each new form. But that's how you could submit your podcast. Now, whether they accept your podcast, that's a different issue. And there are even some things I don't really like about how they're doing it. Like they download your media and rehost it. They can call back to your stats provider potentially, depending on who your stats provider is. Like I know that Libsyn, for example, can integrate with Spotify stats. So you can see your Spotify downloads inside of Libsyn. But with other providers, maybe, maybe not. So that's how you can get on Spotify. Thanks for the question, Cameron. Next, Mykahl, I think that's how you pronounce the name. It's not standard spelling, so that's why I'm not sure. Said, we use Podtrac to keep tabs on listener base. Is there a robust method to get numbers about our listenership? Well, Mykahl, I think that Podtrac is one of those services you can use and trust. Libsyn, Podbean, and Podtrac have the best, most reliable industry standard podcast measurement statistics that you can find out there. They follow the IAB. They've been following the Association of Downloadable Media long before the public radio people came in and made their own Wild West of podcast stats. But there are standards out there, and you're using one of those standard platforms, Podtrac. So as long as you have it integrated with each media URL, both on your website, if someone can visit your website and press play, and in your RSS feed, then every download bounces through Podtrac's server and then goes to wherever you're hosting that media, whether that's Libsyn, Blueberry, Spreaker, even places like SoundCloud or your own website or archive.org, anything like that. That'll work with it, as long as that Podtrac tracker redirect is integrated with that. And you can follow Podtrac's guides to see how to integrate their tracker with whatever you're using for your RSS feed creation tool. So then inside of Podtrac, or if you use any other provider, you'll be able to see your download stats. So when you want to know about your listenership, the thing to do would be to look at your downloads for a single episode. A couple ways to look at this. First, look at it 1 week after you've published it. Within that 1 week, you can assume those are your most loyal listeners. That's probably the number of your actual subscribers to your podcast, what you get downloaded within that first week of publication. But up to a month later, look at that number again for one episode, that is. And you'll see then that's probably your total audience size. So that would include more people kind of stumbling upon your episode, listening later, downloading it later. And then you can keep track of that either mentally, just to know, okay, it was 3,300 or 300, whatever. Let's say it's 200 this month, and next month you look at your next episode and it's 250, the next episode is 300, so you see your numbers are going up, something like that. So you're looking at the downloads per episode for one episode after about a week and after about a month, and that gives you an idea of your listenership. Don't look at downloads per month, downloads per day, downloads per week of multiple episodes, because that's a completely unreliable, meaningless number, since it can be easily gamed with many things. And I've done an episode recently about that over at theaudacitypodcast.com/meaningless-stats. You can learn more about why feed hits and monthly downloads are meaningless stats over there. Mike Wilkerson from the chat room asked, when connecting with a website host to host your media files, if not choosing to go with, say, a Libsyn or Blueberry hosting solution, what are a series of good need-to-be-able-tos when it comes to asking questions of a media host? The most important things, I think, for if you're looking at creating both your RSS feed and hosting your media with someone other than those companies that I and other professionals recommend, like Blueberry, Libsyn, Podbean, and maybe Spreaker. A few things to ask them. First of all, do they let you place a permanent lifetime 301 redirect on your RSS feed in case you ever want to leave them? Find out, is there a fee to do that kind of thing, or is it free to do? Also, find out what kind of stats they use and whether you can trust their stats to be IAB compliant. IAB is the Interactive Advertising Bureau, and they have proposed standards of measuring podcast downloads. And I've seen some of these pop-up startup podcast hosting companies that are not following IAB, and their stats sometimes are subject to certain things like bots. Someone recently, I think on Reddit, said that their particular startup podcast hosting company, they noticed a big spike in downloads, and it was all from a bot because that podcast hosting company doesn't have their algorithms refined. They're not following IAB guidelines. And so certain bot downloads are measured. Whereas you look at Blueberry, Libsyn, Podtrac, maybe Spreaker, Podbean, these are companies that have invested heavily into refining their algorithms. And so you can trust that they wouldn't show those bot download spikes because bot downloads really don't matter at all. Yes, it bumps your number up, but that doesn't mean more people are listening, and you don't want to charge an advertiser for bot downloads. So you ask them, can you redirect your RSS feed? Do they support the IAB podcast measurement guidelines? And some other things to check would be, do they submit your podcast feed for you to podcast apps and directories? You don't want them to do that. You want to be in control. You want to be the one to submit their feed. Do they support the new iTunes tags that were released in summer of 2017? If they don't, stay away from them. Do they provide, if you're going to use them for your website as well, do they provide the option for you to map a domain to your website, like through a CNAME record or something like that? So someone could visit myawesomepodcast.com. Their browser lands on myawesomepodcast.com, but it's a web page powered by their own system. For example, SoundCloud, Spreaker, you can't do that. But Libsyn, Blueberry, Podbean, you can do that kind of thing with them. Some places may charge a little bit more to do that, and I think that's reasonable to do. Other things like, do they re-encode your media? If you upload your file at 64 kilobits per second mono, you don't want them re-encoding it to 32 kilobits per second or to stereo or changing any of the encoding. Do they mess with the ID3 tags? Do they do anything else like that? Do they charge you? Yes, I think you should be paying for podcast media hosting because these free places often die. So if you want your podcast to stay online, I recommend that you really make that investment to pay because you get what you pay for. So those are some of the important things. I also did an episode recently about this at the audacitypodcast.com about things to check with your media host's RSS feed. That was episode 328, 8 things to check with your media host podcast RSS feed. And you can check that out at theaudacitypodcast.com/328. Or if you're subscribed, you can find out there. So number 1 was check which RSS feed is actually being used. Number 2, check who controls the Apple Podcast Connect account. Number 3, check whether you can redirect the RSS feed. Number 4, check that your email address is in the feed. That's very important too. Number 5, check that the website URL points to your website. Number 6, check that episode links point to the correct episode web pages. 7, check that you can include HTML in the show notes. You can't do that with everybody. Number 8, check for full support of the new iTunes tags. So that's the audacitypodcast.com/328 if you want to learn more about that. So thank you, Mike, for that question. Guadalupe asked, I'm looking to do a live stream talk show with a total of 2 people. I know you suggested using multiple microphones, but what we want to avoid is having to wear headphones and use separate microphones due to budget and setting of the show. Would you happen to have any other ideas on how we can work with this? Well, your audio is always going to be better if each person speaking has their own microphone. Having their own microphone doesn't mean they have to wear headphones as long as they have some good microphone technique. But having their own microphone will give you the best results because then you don't have to worry about pointing a microphone back and forth like interview style. And having your own microphone then gives you so much control, better quality, everything like that. However, when you're talking about budget and setting of the show, not quite sure what you mean of setting of the show, like setting up the show, physically setting it up and such. But one microphone that does do really well in a case like this, if you only have 2 people, and if you can be in a good environment, is the Shure MV88. This is a microphone that can plug into an Apple device via a Lightning port. And you can put it into, I forget what they call the mode, but it's a dual side mode, basically, where you can hold the microphone between you and the person you're talking. And as long as you're facing each other, it picks up on both sides of the mic, and it can pick up both sides independently, so you can have different control. And the quality is pretty good as long as you're in a quiet environment and you can be somewhat close to each other. But it doesn't have to be awkwardly close where you're practically kissing each other to share a microphone, but you can hold it between you where it's maybe not even a full arm width away from you, but maybe a foot away from you, then a foot away from the other person. So then your face is 2 feet away from the other person's face. I think that could be an option to work with. Or if we're talking about feet, that would be about 30 centimeters away from you to the microphone, and then 30 centimeters from the microphone to the other person. So that's 60 centimeters between you and the other person. So that can give you pretty good audio quality. But still, I highly recommend each person have their own microphone. And when you say due to budget, that microphone is around $100, I think, or $150. And that might be more expensive than buying multiple microphones. Like you could get 2 Audio-Technica ATR 2100 USB microphones and plug those into your computer with some extra software to record multiple USB devices at the same time. Or you could plug those into a recorder. That starts to get a little bit more expensive, though. But thanks for the question, Guadalupe. Nate Wang asked, is it possible to reassign the primary category for a podcast? I believe that I selected business as the featured category for my podcast when I first launched, but as the show has progressed, I'm not so sure that it belongs there. If it is possible, can you speak at all to the potential ramifications to changing the category designation? Will it impact ratings, searchability, etc.? Thanks for the question, Nate. You can change your podcast category at any time because that comes from your RSS feed. So all you need to do is change the setting in your RSS feed, and Apple Podcasts and other podcast apps and directories will eventually update, usually automatically. So that is totally possible to do. And you can have a podcast appear in multiple categories at the same time, but it's that first one that really matters the most. That's where you'll usually be listed and rated, ranked as well. So will this impact ratings? If you mean ratings like star ratings, no, it won't. And your reviews, it won't impact that. Now, your ranking, it will impact because you'll no longer appear in the ranking for the category that you either demote or remove from your feed. For example, if I take the Audacity to podcast out of the tech podcasting category and move it instead into the business category as the first podcast, then I would probably lose my place in the tech podcasting category because that's no longer my primary category. I would instead be ranking in the business category, and there the competition is much higher. So I don't lose my ranking. I'm really just being ranked in a completely different category against completely different competition. It's not like I would drop in the rankings, but it might seem like I'm dropping in the rankings because of how the system ends up working for being in a different category. So thank you for the question, Nate. Zubair Ashref said, I submitted a podcast to iTunes using my personal Apple ID. Would you be able to advise on how to move it to my corporate account? My corporate Apple ID is now created, but it still does not have iTunes Connect account. The tough thing with this is, as of right now, Apple doesn't support easily moving a podcast between Apple IDs. They will soon support this. And it's something that some podcasters have been waiting for 12 years to be able to do. right now we're in this transition point where, unfortunately, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer, but I do think it will be really soon. If not by the end of 2017, I think definitely in 2018, you'll be able to request that kind of thing to be moved. And this will be very important because Apple is about to provide a lot of stats for how people listen and consume your podcast within the Apple Podcast app. And you'll be able to see how far they listened on average, how quickly they listen, or where they skip in episodes. You'll get that only from the Apple Podcast app subscribers. And those stats will come through the Podcast Connect account. But to share that with your boss, you'd have to either give them access to your personal account, which I don't recommend, or maybe export those reports or take screenshots and such until Apple allows you to transfer ownership of that, which I think they'll let you start doing in 2018 because they know a lot of people don't have access to their stats. So already they're trying to ensure everyone will have access. But for your new stuff, just wait it out and at some point contact Apple through their support link. And if they say resubmit your podcast under the new Apple ID, don't do that. They're just giving the answer now for those people who are so desperate to change ownership that they're willing to remove their podcast from Apple. Don't go that way. Just wait until they can actually transfer ownership, which they should be able to do at some point. Mike Wilkerson asked, how do you see those in professional radio imprinting their previous experience-based norms onto the podcast industry? Better yet, how can we help ensure that they're helping to propagate podcast industry trends rather than a Frankenstein radio environment? Radio demographics, listener values, etc. Are samples. This is tough because the people coming into podcasting with this radio background, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them seem to be coming in with this arrogant approach. And now they have vast experience in broadcasting, in storytelling, in creating content. So they are highly skilled. Let's not think that they're coming in stupid and anything like that. They know how to create amazing content and produce it. They have a very different perspective on creating content, though, than most podcasters. Nonetheless, they're very, very good at it. But what I do see happening is that when they come into this space, it really feels like they're treating podcasting as legitimate only now because they're here. It's like, hey, you little amateurs who've been playing with podcasting, you just move aside because now this is a real thing because we're here. And that really bothers me. So these professional radio people coming in are really looking at the podcasting industry as simply another distribution channel or a new place to produce and release their content instead of radio. They're often ignoring the history of the industry, certainly ignoring the pioneers who have been here, the independent people who are creating amazing content with small niche audiences. I really don't think that they're really going to help the independent podcast industry, but they can certainly help the podcast industry as a whole because they are experts at creating content that appeals to an extremely broad audience. And by doing that, they can bring more people to podcasts because they have a whole lot more leverage than we have. So while people come in because they hear, oh, I can subscribe to this really cool podcast from this radio company or whatever, and it shares these amazing stories that I'd love to connect with and such, that's fine. That gets people into podcasts. And then let the big guys deal with the how to subscribe and that kind of issue. And then people will eventually discover the niche. Now, it's like the first time you go out to eat. This metaphor might break it down at some point, but it's kind of like the first time you go out to eat, your first time ever. Maybe you go to a McDonald's and you're like, whoa, this is really good. And then you try a Wendy's and then you try a Burger King and you're like, whoa, this is pretty cool. So those are the big burger companies. But then you discover the boutique burger shops that make gourmet burgers. You start to niche down. You discover the mom and pop hole-in-the-wall shops somewhere that's only available in your local town, and they make amazing burgers. And they're so much better. They're so much more creative. You start to niche down on your burgers. And I think the same thing will happen with podcasts, that, yeah, the big NPR-like or the radio background-like podcasters are the Burger Kings, McDonald's, and Wendy's of the podcast industry. But then the independents are those small businesses, those who make great art of a product. And it just takes people to be exposed to that a little bit to discover that kind of content later on. So I think we can see the podcast, the professional, or I like to call them corporate podcasters, not prosumers or procasters or anything like that, because I think we as independents can still be professional about what we're doing. So I think saying amateur versus professional, I think that's the wrong direction to go. I like to look at it as corporate versus independent. Even if you're independent, you could still be associated with others, but basically you're approaching it from an independent perspective. You are independent of a marketing team or policies and committees and such for the most part. So I think corporate podcasters bring in the massive audience. We as independents really help the industry grow. And it's a responsibility on us. Adrian Bear said, I was wondering if you could answer a question for me about video conversion. I'm having trouble converting a video file down to a decent size for uploading my video podcast to YouTube. Do you have any suggestions on software? I find the files I end up with are around 30 or so gigabytes. I'd like to get them down to maybe 2 gigabytes, but I lose a lot of quality. Well, thank you for the question, Adrian. This depends on what software you're already using. Most likely, it sounds like you are exporting at high definition, 1080p, maybe even higher, maybe even 4K. And you're exporting at a very high quality setting. Now, even though that might be a massive file, when you upload it to YouTube, YouTube will re-encode it. They will convert it to their own resolution. So you don't really have to worry about storage limits on YouTube, but depending on your internet connection, it could take days to upload a 30 gigabyte file. So I totally understand why you'd want to get this down. Look inside of your video program and look for if they have any kind of YouTube presets or something like that, a 1080p YouTube preset or 720p or whatever resolution you're doing. And that, yes, it does reduce the quality, but it's barely noticeable, really. Yes, you might be able to see, okay, this is how I recorded it. This is how it was encoded. And if I zoom in on this pixel, I can see this pixel is blurred. No one else is going to do that. So use those presets. Look for those presets inside of your program for converting those. If your program doesn't give you easy presets like that for YouTube or Vimeo or something like that, then what you could do is get the free program called Handbrake, and that's at handbrake.fr. So that's handbrake.fr. Handbrake is free software, runs on both macOS and Windows, and that can convert video for you. So in Handbrake, you have the option to do, well, let me just read some of these for you. Some of your presets are fast 1080p. There's a web option. That's for Gmail and such devices, legacy. I think looking at their different settings inside of Handbrake, what you'd probably want to do is simply maybe the fast 1080p version or HQ. There's some different options in there you can play with, but probably fast 1080p 30 frames per second will be good enough for you. And I can't tell you exactly how big your files will be. They will still be a few gigabytes, especially if like it's an hour-long video. That will be several gigabytes. But the nice thing is on YouTube, you don't have to worry about storage limits. So Handbrake should help you, or look for those presets inside of your app. Mike Wilkerson, who is very active in the chat room right now, had another question. He asked 3 efforts in the coming year. Plan to institute Let me read this again. 3 efforts in the coming year. Plan to institute a massive video enhancements of the known podcast statistics providers who's really got their game on when it comes to video podcasting, tracking, etc. Other to-dos when leaping into video programming, seeing as how you've already doing a ton of video capture now. Video podcasting is expensive. It's expensive in all kinds of ways. First of all, simply to capture video well can be expensive. You need good lighting. Good lighting will make up for any bad video camera, well, almost any bad video camera, as long as you can have manual control over it. Like the way I'm looking so good right now, I'm not using a high-end professional video camera. I'm using the Logitech HD video camera, the C920, which is about $50 right now from Amazon. But I'm using professional lighting to make this look good, and I have specialized control over the camera to control its white balance, its exposure, and everything, so that the professional lighting can work really well with this camera. The professional lighting in this case costs more than the camera. Even if I was going with basic CFL lighting, which compact fluorescent light bulbs, you can get a decent kit for around $150 with 3 separate lights. That can look really good, but that's $150, and the C920 is still only about $50. But the lighting matters so much more to the quality of the video. What matters most in video, though, is really the audio quality, because people need to be able to hear you more than they need to be able to see you. They'll accept lower quality video as long as they can hear you properly. So if you are recording on your regular podcast audio equipment, like I'm recording with right now, you'll get very high audio quality, but it may interfere with the video a little bit because here I have this gigantic microphone in my face. I don't have free range of my hands to be able to move my hands around where I want. I have to avoid hitting the microphone. This can be a little distracting. Now I can position this microphone in slightly different ways and change the audio quality just a little bit. Or I could look at things like wearing a lavalier microphone clipped to my shirt somewhere. Or I could have a shotgun microphone positioned just outside of frame pointing down at me. Depending on my environment, that may or may not work well and other things. So these are all things that can add up to additional purchases that can make your podcasting more complicated, more expensive, as well as hosting the media files. Now, video podcasts were really popular back in 2005, 2006, before YouTube came along. YouTube has really dominated in the video consumption space. And now things like Facebook and LinkedIn are offering native video consumption on their social platforms as well. So if you are doing a video show, definitely put it on YouTube. I also recommend uploading it directly to Facebook and LinkedIn if you can, and some of these places like that, so that people can consume it on the native platform. Like I'm recording this live right now through Facebook Live. When I finish this recording, the video remains as a native video on Facebook Live, but I'm also recording the video locally and I upload that video to YouTube. So you can consume on either of those platforms. What I don't do is release this video as a video podcast. I keep thinking someday I'll release the audio from these Q&As as an audio podcast, and maybe you're listening to it as an audio podcast if you're listening from the future. So hosting that video file for a podcast download is what can get expensive because video files can be really big. What you might want to consider is maybe releasing a lower resolution version as the video podcast, which is downloadable. Thus, you don't need gigabytes of bandwidth for the video. You only need hundreds of megabytes. That can still be costly. What you might want to consider instead is, if this can work with your content, release the audio as your podcast, but publish the video on video platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and such. And when you're doing that, you have to keep in mind your audio audience. I say this often, when you're doing video, it can be really tempting to start referring to something as if everyone sees what you're referring to. I can say, oh, this little blue thing, or this thing right here, this is really nice because I can do this to it, and then I can also do this, and I can do that, and don't you like this thing? Now, a listening audience has no idea whatsoever what I'm talking about, what I'm doing, what I'm holding, what I'm referring to, why they should even care. That's bad audio content. You can try to make good audio content even though you're recording video by describing things. I can say, look at this blue squishy ball. I can squeeze it to relieve some stress. I can toss it up and down. I could juggle it. I could spin it around. It has the word blueberry written on it. It's from the Blueberry Media Hosting Company. This is a cool squishy toy that I can squish whenever I get stressed, or I can just bounce it off the walls and annoy my neighbors. See, what I've done is described it, not in obnoxious detail, but I've communicated more about it instead of simply saying this and that and here and there, those kinds of things. So I can still release that kind of description in audio, and the audio audience will understand it. If you really, though, want to release a video podcast, then the same media hosting companies, Blueberry, Libsyn, Podbean, can support that, but be prepared to pay a lot more for those downloads. Dale Asseron said, I have a question with domain picking. Our desired one is taken, and am wondering if we should just add the word podcast to the name or even go with .audio as a domain. What are your thoughts with that? Well, first thing I would caution you with is if the domain is already taken for a name you want to use, do they have a trademark on that name? Are they claiming a trademark at all, whether it's registered or not registered? If they have a TM, then it's not registered. If they have an R with the circle around it, it's a registered trademark. And you might run into some problems with that. If you launch your show, they can come after you and say, you're violating our trademark. This has nothing to do with copyrights. It's about trademarks, the name of your brand that you're launching. So like, for example, Microsoft.com is taken. So if I wanted to do Microsoft Show or MicrosoftPodcast.com, Microsoft will come after me and say, that sounds like you're violating our trademark. Actually, I would be violating their trademark. And they might say, it sounds like it's official. It's affiliated with us. No, you can't call your show Microsoft Show, and you can't use the brand MicrosoftShow.com. That's completely unacceptable. And they would be fully justified in doing that. I might have to go to court, or I might just get a letter from their lawyers saying, hey, cease and desist doing this. And I have to figure out what to do that would be acceptable. So if someone else has that domain already, you might be running into trademark issues. Simply because they have the domain doesn't mean they're claiming it as a trademark, but they could be claiming it as a trademark. You have to look at their site. And I really recommend looking at other possible names for your show. Now, if it's generic and it's not something that can really be trademarked, or if it's a completely different industry, like, for example, when I first started my business, which is technically named D. Joseph Design, I looked at, let's see if this website is still online. I was thinking of the brand name D. Joseph Design. And yeah, sure enough, so I looked up djoseph.com to see if that was available, and it wasn't. djoseph.com is a construction, property management, brokerage company. So for my business to be named D. Joseph Design, I'm in a completely different industry. Not doing construction. I'm doing podcasting, or back then it was design work, consulting, education, and such. So a completely different industry, it's totally okay. But you need to talk to a lawyer about things when it comes to trademarks and such. Interestingly, one of their logos, one of their letters in their logo looks a lot like my own. That's interesting. So some things to keep in mind. Now, if it's a generic term, maybe adding show or podcast to the domain would be okay. Like my Once podcast is technically simply called Once, but we added podcast to the domain, or show can sometimes work. So some things to keep in mind. As much as possible, I really recommend going with .com because that's still what people think by default, but it's okay to consider some of those others like .audio, .show, .net, .tv, .fm, some of that. But still, people think by default .com. Mike Wilkerson said, the Audio-Technica, well, the ATR 2100 is a great cost-effective go-to, but what other USB-capable mics do you recommend that doesn't feel so muted, that can be whipped out, connected, capture, and be done? Well, there's the Audio-Technica ATR 2100 USB, the Audio-Technica AT2005. Those are pretty much about the same. They're not the same microphones, but they are very close. There's also the Samson Q2U, which, again, same basic design and features, but it is, I think, 3 decibels more sensitive. And there's another microphone, which I'll have a video review of this coming out very soon. It's the Sennheiser Hand Mic Digital for $260. And it can plug in via USB or Lightning, even directly to your phone. That's 7 decibels more sensitive and has a lower self-noise floor. And it's a really good microphone, actually. Very nicely designed, great build quality. It will last really well. It is pricey, but you're paying for higher quality. So those are a couple USB-capable mics. The Sennheiser hand mic, though, can't plug into XLR. Now, the muted feeling, that's really about how you use the microphone. If you get, with most microphones, the closer you get to the microphone, you get this thing called, I forget the name of it now, but proximity effect, that's it. Where with most microphones, the closer you get to the microphone, the more bassy it sounds, and potentially the more muffled it sounds. There are some other things that might be contributing to the muffled sound of a microphone, such as your pop filter. I've noticed a very slight difference in sound when I have a pop filter versus when I don't. Also, so if you're too close to the microphone, which you might be doing since it's a rather quiet microphone, that might end up sounding a bit more muffled and muted in some ways. So just back away from the microphone a little bit more, at least a fist width away, maybe a little bit farther, depending on your environment and noise and such in your space. Now, when you're talking about muted, this could also, if you're talking about like a muffled, more bassy, not as clear or crisp sound, you might even want to consider going with a dynamic microphone that has a USB attachment to it. Like the Audio-Technica, I think it's the AT2020, or maybe it's the 2200. I'm pretty sure it's the 2020, is a USB connectable microphone, and not USB and XLR like the 2100 is, but it is USB. And that is a condenser microphone. It's still cardioid, so it still picks up this more narrow field. But the nice thing about condenser microphones is they do pick up a wider range of frequencies. So you get more clarity on the higher end, especially, not as much muffled sound as you might get with dynamic microphones. The thing about condenser microphones picking up distant sound or background noise more, that's a misconception or an outright myth, depending on the specifics of how people explain that. But it is true that it picks up more frequencies, and in some cases, like a fan, might be more noticeable in those frequencies. But talking about like a cricket outside or dog barking or some talking in the background, a condenser microphone really won't make much difference over a dynamic microphone. So maybe consider a condenser microphone if you want a bit more clarity with your podcast audio that you're picking up. Madrid Tom, is that Tom Madrid? Madrid Tom asked this question saying, do you think the radio folks coming into podcasting will help people pay attention to good production quality, both listeners and regular podcasters, or do you feel that most podcasts already have good enough quality? I'm not saying that good audio equals a good podcast, just asking your opinion about the influence of the pro radio folks on amateur podcasters and whether you feel it's a net gain for the community. Well, I think when you look at the serious podcasters out there, I think we've reached the bar of good audio quality. And we've been at that bar for years, more than a decade. Since the beginning of podcasting, some people have invested in good equipment and learning how to use that equipment properly. And like the NPR sound, for example, is really a matter of equalization, EQ, some compression, some effects that they apply maybe on their audio. And there are some ways that you can really finely enhance that. Chris Curran from Podcast Engineering School is one of our podcast audio mastering and audio production experts inside of Podcaster Society. And he is an expert at getting the perfect sound with your audio, as well as cleaning up audio and such. And he's a great expert to have inside of Podcaster Society with some of his training and his answering questions and such. Check out podcastersociety.com to join that membership. It's open at all times, so you can join it at any time. Join for a month, join for a year, join month by month. podcastersociety.com. So he can tell you how to get better sounding audio or how to process your audio to sound better. But the thing is, we're talking about small enhancements that, yes, you can notice these enhancements if you're listening side by side on studio quality headphones or studio monitor headphones. But for most people, they're listening through earbuds. They're listening through basic speakers, basic headphones. They're not going to notice these small distant differences. The most important thing is that you can be heard. So your audio quality, your audio loudness is at a consistent level, and you can be understood. Your audio is clear enough for people to hear and understand what you're saying. So I think we've had that ability since the beginning, and many podcasters have been using that ability from the beginning. Like, look at, for example, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. Since the beginning, and it's one of the most popular podcasts out there, and the episodes are hours long. His audio quality is great. It's been great for years and years. Now, if he starts listening to these NPR and public radio inspired podcasts, he might hear great audio quality. Is that going to change how he does his show? Probably not. Are listeners going to listen to a public radio inspired podcast and then listen to Dan Carlin's podcast and say, ew, Dan Carlin's audio is horrible compared to the radio? No, probably not. We're at a point now that good audio quality is extremely reachable. What really sets apart the corporate podcasters from the independent podcasters is the corporate podcasters' ability to create really good content and to produce it really well. And their production might come in editing. It might come in sound effects and how they mix things together, the different voices and talents they bring in. Now, you can create content just as good or better than the public radio podcasters or the corporate podcasters coming into the space because you can know your niche better than they can. And the production level can also be something that you can reach by getting better at presenting and communicating. So back to your question of, will this help podcasting? I think the shows that have bad audio quality, at least from my experience, they also have bad content quality and bad presentation quality. They have bad quality in all kinds of ways. There are very, very few shows that have really good content and communication, presentation of that content, but bad production quality. Yes, I have heard some. Like, for example, Dan Miller's podcast, 48 Days to the Work You Love. Many years ago, it had horrible audio quality. And then around, I forget what year, maybe 2008, 2009, Dan Miller met Cliff Ravenscraft, and Cliff started helping Dan Miller on his podcast and made his podcast audio much, much better. So that's an example where Dan's podcast was still succeeding, growing an audience before. The audio quality just wasn't very good, though. And maybe, well, I don't know what Dan's experience was with editing audio before then or working with audio, but now it's much better. It's noticeably better. That's one of the exceptions, I think. You look at other very successful podcasters, whether that's in a small niche or a large niche, and I think they already have good enough quality. So yes, it's a challenge. It's something for independent podcasters to remember, but something that I tweet out frequently. It's in my little queue that tweets out often, and I almost always get a response. A couple things. Good audio will not fix bad podcast content. You can have the best microphone, best mixing, best production ever, but if your content is horrible, no one will want to stay. The other thing I frequently tweet out, and I always get a response where someone is like, but wait, this other thing is, I say something to the lines of, basically, no one will listen to a podcast only because their audio quality is great. Although bad audio quality can certainly turn away an audience, good audio quality doesn't bring an audience. Here's an example on the movie side of things. Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Great production quality. Story quality? No, not really there. Or here's another one, Dragon Wars. Really good production quality, great animation, great music too. I love the soundtrack to Dragon Wars. Story quality? Not there at all. So you may hear people say, oh, Star Wars Episode 1 had all of these amazing things with the production quality, but so many people say, Jar Jar Binks or Episode 1 so doesn't fit with the story or all of this stuff. Or you look at Pixar's first full-length movie, Toy Story. Go back and watch that, and you'll see the animation quality isn't as good as we have today, but the story still lasts. That story is timeless. It's still enjoyable because it's such a good story. Or even It's a Wonderful Life. That's a Christmas tradition in my parents' family to watch It's a Wonderful Life. Production quality is nothing compared to today, but the story quality is there, the content quality. So while production quality is important, it's not the most important thing. I think it can remind podcasters to make good production quality, but I think most people who are serious about their podcasts and making quality content are also serious about making quality production. So thanks for the question or the comment as well. Let's see, going back, I am almost at time here. So quick fire here, the lightning round. Mike Wilkerson said, saw a variety of Black Friday awesomeness in regard to Stitcher Premium last week. Any ideas why one would decide to choose Premium that we podcasters would care about? Stitcher Premium is, Stitcher is now owned by Midroll or EW Scripts. And Stitcher Premium is their reattempt at making Howl. And it's kind of like trying to be the Netflix of podcasts. And it's an interesting approach, really. Think YouTube Red, think Netflix, where you might get exclusive shows or you get more content from the shows you really like. I think the average podcaster, Stitcher Premium is irrelevant to us. It's really for the big time podcasters, big time content creators. If you're a big fan of the shows on Stitcher Premium, then Stitcher Premium might be a thing you would want to consider. Maybe someday Apple will even provide their own model, kind of like YouTube Red or that kind of thing, where you pay a premium subscription fee and you get access to exclusive content. Other platforms are trying that, like Audible has their audio channels and some other places like that. For the average podcaster, I don't think it matters. Michael Ray asked, is it best to trademark if you want to use a domain name for only you? I think it's good if you have something that sounds like a unique name. I think it's good to trademark it regardless. Now, trademarking does not have to be a thing that you approach the government for. And certainly check if you're outside the US. I have no idea how trademarks and copyrights work there. So check with your local places. But in the United States, trademarking gives you protection over that name. If you can at any time, if you come up with a name like the Audacity to Podcast, for example, well, don't come up with that because that's my trademark. I've been using it and claiming it as a trademark. So for years, I've put the little TM symbol next to the name on the website. And that's my way of indicating, hey, I'm claiming this as a trademark. But since it's just the TM symbol, that indicates that it's not registered. If I did go with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO.gov, if you're interested, I could register that trademark, and then it would be so much easier to protect it. I could go after anyone and say, hey, this is my registered trademark, and they would have to comply with it. Now, if it's merely a claimed trademark, then they don't have to comply with it, but it is still defendable, especially if I can show that it's unique, that I've been using it for a long time, and indicating that I'm claiming it as a trademark. So for your podcast name, here's your little assignment. Regardless of what your podcast name is, I recommend you put a TM on your website, maybe in your footer. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but maybe here and there when you use it, put that little TM to indicate you are claiming this as a trademark. So that way, if someday down the road someone says that, hey, I want to use this name, you're infringing on it, or something like that, or someone else uses your name or your title down the road, you can say, hey, I've been using this and claiming it as a trademark for years. And under the Lanham, I think, Act of 1998, I believe, you can defend an unregistered trademark. So you can approach those and say, hey, this is my trademark. Please change your name. Look, I've been using it for this long. If it goes to court, it is harder to defend if it's not registered, but it is still defendable. Now, if it is registered, it's super easy to defend and protect that trademark. Mike Wilkerson said, do the available categories on, say, iTunes/Apple Podcasts get enhanced often? Is there a word of an expansion anytime soon? I don't think so. So we have certain categories from Apple, and many other podcast apps then simply copy those categories. I think if Apple was going to extend the categories that are available to put your podcast in, I think they would have done that at the same time as they launched these new iTunes tags for like seasons and serials and episode numbers and such. So that doesn't mean that Apple won't do it in the future. But I think if we were going to see them do it, now would have been the ideal time that they would have launched it. A lot of people think there should be like a true crime category or storytelling category or something like that, or certain categories, certainly. I think Apple is pretty content with the categories that they have now. And if they did launch new categories and you put your podcast in those new categories, then you might have concerns with all of the other podcast apps that don't have those categories yet. So it would be a bigger change in the industry would be required than the new tags that Apple supports, because you can use those new tags and they don't break your RSS feed, and you can use those tags like the trailer, the episode number, the seasons and such, and they just won't show up in other podcast apps. It doesn't break anything, but changing categories could potentially break things. Michael Ray asked, what do you think about ClickFunnels? I'm not sure if you're talking about ClickFunnels, the specific software, or the idea of funnels. I actually don't have much experience with ClickFunnels as software, but talking about funnels, there are a lot of marketing tools out there. Sometimes the best thing to do, regardless of what marketing tool you're looking at, is go ahead, buy it, make sure it has the 30-day refund guarantee, and understand your conditions with that. But go ahead and buy it, try it, give it a legitimate use. And then if it doesn't work for you, or you don't like the way it works, then return it. And last question, Mike Wilkerson asked, does Apple plan on allowing multiple users to access the enhanced statistics coming up? That I know of, I don't think so. That's where I think the best idea, Max Flight, one of the members of Podcaster Society, recommends this, setting up an Apple ID for every podcast you submit. That way you could share that username and password with other people so that they could see the statistics. I think as far as like allowing multiple users to access the statistics, that we might never see, or we might not see for many years. because that gets really complicated. There may be an API so you could export those statistics or make them visible in other ways, like Blueberry, for example. If you pay for premium stats from Blueberry, you can get those. You can bring those stats into like Google Spreadsheets or update them on a page or something because Blueberry provides an API for you. Libsyn, there's no API. Podbean, I don't think there's an API. I think Blueberry might be the only company that provides an API to their stats. And that API allows you to then integrate those stats in other places so that you could give other people access to the stats without giving them access to your account. Thank you very much for all of these questions. If you have other questions that you'd like me to answer in a future Q&A, then email feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com and try and keep your question concise. And I'll address it on one of these Q&As that I normally do on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. If you'd like more help, one-on-one help, or help to improve the podcast that you've already launched, then Podcasters Society is for you. We provide encouraging community, expert support, and in-depth training to help you make your podcast amazing. Check it out at podcasterssociety.com. And I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for watching.